with Mr. Abbott Johnston. Mr. Johnston is a lifelong resident of Muncie. His grandfather was one of the people who helped to establish the Warner-Gear Corporation back in the early part of the 20th century. Mr. Johnston has been kind enough to volunteer this interview, and he and I have been talking for the past 20 minutes or so, and we've had a very interesting discussion. He is related to, by marriage, to the Goldwater family, Mrs. Goldwater being a cousin, I believe.
First cousin.
First cousin. And also Mr. Abbott Johnston has also worked at Warner-Gear. Now, Mr. Johnston, as you recall, I'm using most of this material as a primary source, trying to reconstruct some history of the labor movement and the industry here in Muncie. And you, no doubt, are one of the most knowledgeable people in the field. The tape will be placed in Ball State University Library and will become a permanent part of the history of the community. It will be available for students and teachers interested in the history of the Muncie community, of industry, and of labor, hopefully for many years to come. And may I express my appreciation of your willingness to take the time out and talk with me, help prepare this tape for Ball State University. Suppose we began, Mr. Johnston, by asking you to tell me what you can to reconstruct about Warner-Gear. When did it start? Who started it? What were the purposes? These sorts of things, and then we'll go from there.
Well, of course, I was an infant when Warner-Gear was started, and most of the information I have about its early history is by word of mouth from my grandfather. My own father, who died when he was treasurer of Warner-Gear at the age of 45 in 1919, from Ray Johnson, his brother, who was general manager of Warner-Gear initially, and my uncle Charles Davis, who married my father's sister, who took my father's place at Warner-Gear Company as secretary and treasurer when my father passed away. Then later on was instrumental in the formation of the Borg-Warner Corporation, becoming its first chairman, and after a year of that, George Borg, who had become president, relinquished that job, and Mr. Charles Davis, my uncle, became president, where he served until the late 1940s, when he became chairman of the corporation, and Roy Ingersoll then became president of Borg-Warner. My understanding of the formation of Warner-Gear Company is that my grandfather, Abbott Johnson, and several of his associates, including Mr. W.E. Hitchcock and Mr. Thomas Morgan, let's see, well, I don't recall any other names at the moment, decided to establish a telephone exchange here, and brought Richard C. Stone to Muncie as an electrical engineer to make the installation. One of the items that was used in some volume was called a pole changer. And as I understand it, it changed the poles from plus to minus, and that made the hammer or clapper of the bell ring, oscillate from side to side and ring the bell in the telephone. And these men thought that this device would have wide general use and demand, and that it would be something to manufacture in volume. it was manufactured more or less by hand, and the ones that were installed in Muncie were made by the Warners. There were 5 brothers. Hugh was the inventor of the pole changer, and later on of the sliding gear transmission and a differential. And Will, Tom, Henry, and Frazier. Now, Frazier and Tom Warner and Hugh were the only brothers that came here and associated themselves with this pole changer business, which was then established as the Warner Electric Company, and I believe the year was 1901. Will Warner and Henry Warner were not associated with this enterprise, but Frazier, Tom, and Hugh were. Tom happened to be of the outgoing salesman type of person. And
Did you know him personally?
Yes, I know him personally quite well. And very personable. They called him Uncle Midas in his family because everything he touched seemed to turn to money. And he used his brother's inventions and devices, and he himself made quite a fortune from them, but the other two did not fare so well. So I think there was not a very kindly feeling among the Warners for Tom Warner. In any event, the sliding gear transmission was invented by Hugh Warner, who was then working for the Warner Electric Company. And as I heard the tale, the transmission was taken to Detroit and exhibited to the Hudson Motor Company people, who realized that it was a rather radical departure from the normal planetary type transmission, and had some excellent features that recommended it for the adoption in cars. And as I recall, Warner Gear was given an order for something like 1,000 of them, and quite a sizable figure. And the men who went to Hudson, it included my grandfather and my Uncle Ray, and I believe my father, J. Edgar Johnson, came back, and it was decided that tools would be procured through a loan from the Delaware County National Bank, and stock would be issued in a new corporation called the Warner Gear Company. Each of the stockholders in the Warner Electric Company received the same amount of stock in the Warner Gear Company at that time.
You know about when that was? You happen to remember?
I think it was somewhere in the realm of 1903. It may have been earlier, but the manufacture of transmissions was started in the building that housed the Asa Kopf, I think it's spelled K-O-P-F, saloon, which was somewhere along the railroad near Ohio Avenue in Muncie. And that building was converted to a transmission manufacturing plant. Later on, of course, property was obtained along the railroad between Ohio Avenue and Hackley Street, and plants number 1 and 2 of Warner Gear now use all of that space from Ohio to Hackley along the New York Central Railroad.
All right, that's a very good description, I think, of the origins of the organization and how it came about and why it came about. Could you tell me, Mr. Abbott Johnson, when you became associated with Warner Gear? Did you go there as a young man out of college, and in what capacity?
Well, my recollection is that I worked in Warner Gear a couple of summers while I was either in high school or college. I think this must have happened when I was in prep school, but only sporadically. I worked in the return transmission tear-down department. Transmissions that were sent in for repairs. I was one of the fellows that helped tear them down.
Now, your present association is with Warner Machine Products?
Yes.
And this is not part of the Warner Gear Corporation?
No, it's not.
You're chairman of the board of directors, is it called?
Yes, chairman of the board of directors of Warner Machine Products.
How long have you been there?
I went to Warner Electric Company, which was then the name of the company, in 1934. In January of 1934, after Mr. Stone, who was the general manager and secretary of the company, and Mr. Hitchcock, who was the vice president, and Mr. Ray Johnson, who was the president, had all passed away within about 3 months. Mr. Charles Davis, my uncle, and I were the other two directors of the company, and at Mr. Stone's funeral, I recall him saying to me, what is the situation at Warner Electric, and why don't you see what you want to do about it? At that time, I was working at Warner Gear Company. After being graduated from MIT, I came here and took a job with Glasco Corporation, then named Glasscock Brothers Manufacturing Company, as an assistant to the general manager, which meant General Flunky. And one of my interesting jobs was to be in charge of safety in the plant. After serving there a couple of years, it seemed that I wanted, or someone wanted me to transfer to Warner Gear, which I did, and went to work for Ralph Allison, who was manager of the service department of Warner Gear. In that capacity, I worked with others in answering letters concerning repairs and troubles with transmissions. And at the same time, Mr. Allison was wanting to broaden his line from merely selling ring gears and pinions and transmission gears and parts, spline shafts and bushings and such, to other items that were called perhaps hard part items in automobiles. Well, in order to make progress in Warner Gear, it was felt by my Uncle Charles and my Uncle Ray Johnson, Uncle Charles Davis and my Uncle Ray Johnson, that I should get more into the engineering department. So my job had been to peruse the Patent Gazette each week as it came in and make note of and indicate what should be done about, or what our engineers should do about various developments or inventions in the gear line. Well, this got to be a rather tedious and exciting task for me, and when Mr. Davis asked if I wanted to do something with the Warner Electric Company, I thought this was the opportunity I'd been wanting, and went to that company as the vice president and general manager. One of the first things we did was to change the name, since we no longer made pole changers, to the Warner Machine Products. And at that time, Mr. Stone had been making, at the time of his death, had been making bushings for the Warner Gear Company and other firms that used bronze, cast bronze bushings that were machined and splined and drilled for oil holes and things of that sort.
No, that's fine. Just about when did you leave Warner Gear, Mr. Johnson, and go to Warner?
I left Warner Gear in 1933, or January 34, rather. But I stayed on the payroll of Warner Gear for some time, about a 6 or 8 month period, while we were trying to get the Warner Machine Products operating, and we were, Warner Machine Products, or Warner Electric Company, was a very important supplier of bushings to Warner Gear, so it couldn't be allowed to fold up as far as Warner Gear was concerned, and they agreed to pay my salary, which the Warner Electric Company couldn't do. And with this arrangement, I was able to devote most of my time to the Warner Electric Company and its successor, the Warner Machine Products. Perhaps in getting into the Warner Electric matter, I've overlooked some features of the Warner Gear Company that should be mentioned, and
Why don't you go ahead then and talk about it?
of which I believe I can recall most of the salient and the features of its history. In about 1914 or 15, I believe, somewhere around that area, perhaps a little later, might have been 1920, there was considerable discussion among different automotive parts groups with respect to establishing other transmission plants or differential plants. Warner Gear also at that time made brake levers and things of that sort that had to do with brakes. Well, Warner Gear at that time decided to discontinue the manufacture of differentials and brakes, and to concentrate their engineering and their talent and their efforts entirely on the transmission business. Well, in those days, I can recall a truck transmission by the number of T64. And there were T64A, B, C, D, E, and F transmissions.
Were they sold to various companies?
They were sold to various truck companies, and each designation meant a different design, main drive gear spline, or the spline that goes in the gear that is the shaft that comes out of the back of the transmission. I don't remember the name of it at the moment. Spline shaft, I guess we used to call it. Well, this was because each company, each each company using the transmission had a different type spline or a different type fitting on the front, on the clutch. Different spline in the clutch, and so the Warner Gear Company in their main drive gear, whose spline stuck out the front of the transmission, had to do all sorts of machining various different designs of spline shafts and main drive gear shafts. And this made the cost of transmissions higher than it should be. Well, Mr. Ray Johnson and Mr. Charles Davis, who had then succeeded my father at his death in 1919 as Secretary and Treasurer of the company, decided that the Warner Gear Company would make 3 transmissions with different torque outputs. That is, they could handle certain torque motors. And rather than design a different transmission for everybody, they would offer these 3 transmissions at a very low price, and the car companies then would adapt their clutch splines and their drive gear, that is their drive gear, universal joint drive in the rear, to the Warner Gear design. This eliminated the manufacture of many hundreds of parts, and by making these 3 transmissions, my recollection of them, first one was named, was numbered T2 transmission, that later became T2C transmission. Then I think there was a T5 or a T4 and a T6. I guess there was a perhaps 3, 4, 5, and 6 was the T6 was the truck transmission that was sold to Ford. So this resulted in the Warner Gear Company being able to sell a T2 transmission for something under $20, as I remember, and with such a radical reduction in price that the car companies went into the program very readily and willingly. It also did convert the Warner Gear Company from a more or less job shop to a high production shop of 3 or 4 or 5 different transmissions. Well, and there was a lot of, there were several additions to the plants at that time. The new offices were built. Additional plant space was arranged for. Plant number 2, where the Ford truck transmission was made, was also built. It abutted on Hackley Street and went east from Hackley along the railroad. Warner Gear stock was put on the market as an over-the-counter security, and funds were raised for these new additions and equipment by the sale of additional stock to the public and to the present stockholders, to the then present stockholders. While all of this was being done, there was a company in Chicago There were two brokerage houses in Chicago, one Paul H. Davis Company, and I've forgotten the other one right now. But these brokerage houses were trying to put together a merger of Mechanics Universal Joint, Rockford, Illinois, the Marvel Carburetor Company of Flint, Michigan, the Morris Chain Company of Detroit and Ithaca, New York. Marvel also had a plant named the Wheeler-Shebler plant in Indianapolis. And Paul H. Davis partners thought that Warner Gear rightly belonged with this group, since they were not competitive and would lend size and stability to the corporation. Well, another firm was the Borg & Beck Klutz Company in Chicago. That was also in this merger. So out of that came the Borg Warner Corporation.
And that was about what year do you remember?
About 1928, or 28 or 29, 27 or 28. And as I said, Mr. Davis became chairman for 1 year, but he actually was the operating head, the chief executive, as George Borg preferred not to do this kind of work. He was more or less of a fellow who liked to give orders and couldn't. He wasn't an outgoing person. He was very dynamic and very original and very positive, and he, in my opinion, didn't get along too well with other people in the organizations. Now, consequently, he was the first one to suggest that Mr. Davis be president and that he take the chairmanship. Mr. Borg take the chairmanship, which was done, and Mr. Davis was the chief executive of the corporation.
Well, very fine. Now, Mr. Johnson,
Another thing I just had.
that's right, go ahead.
One other thing I just have to think. Adding to the Borg Warner Corporation, there were several other companies. One was the Long Radiator and Clutch Company, and Mr. Lester Dryden and his family were the principal owners of that. The board of Borg Warner was comprised of the heads of most of these various families that owned these industries originally, like Dean Francis, who succeeded his father on the board, and I forgot who else came on. Eric Ekstrom was from Mechanics Universal Joint. George Borg was from Borg & Beck. All of this history is recorded in some books, one of which was written by Roy Ingersoll, called From Ox Carts to Jets.
I've heard of that book.
But the people in Muncie think there are quite a few inaccuracies in that book, particularly with respect to the operation of the Warner Gear Company, and who was responsible for the advancement of this corporation here. Warner Gear was the largest of all of the corporations that went into the Borg Warner Corporation.
Is it still?
When I say largest, it had the greatest sales and also the largest fixed investment. I don't really know whether it
Whether
still
it's
is or
still
not. No, I don't. I'm not that familiar with the present board Warner.
Mr. Johnston, most of the fellows I have been talking with who worked at Warner Gear for a very long time are very proud of the fact that they are associated with Warner Gear. They're extremely loyal to the company. They feel that their salaries are superior to the yearly income of people working in comparable industries in this area, and their standard of living is quite satisfactory. I suspect it's probably higher than the average industrial worker in the Midwest. And they attribute a lot of this to the labor union. Now, how long has the labor union been there, and did Warner Gear pay comparatively high wages before the labor union came in? Were you there at that time?
Yes, I was there before the labor union came in as the United Automobile Workers.
Was that the first one, or was there one before that?
Well, that I can't answer.
Okay.
I wasn't that familiar with the shop.
At that time, you were with Warner Products, Warner Machine.
No, at that time I was in college, I expect.
37?
Oh, is that when the UAW came into Warner Gear? Oh, I think long before 37. I know that the UAW came into Warner Machine about 6 months after I got the thing. No, let's see, I guess it was about a year after I went over to Warner Electric Company.
What year was that?
That would be 1935. And they were already well established in Warner Gear by that time. In fact, they were very strong in Warner Gear when I was still there.
Your first contract was 37. Now, before that...
You mean the first UAW contract?
Right. Now, before that, you may have had an AFL local.
You're talking about Warner Gear now,
Right.
not Warner Machine.
I don't know about Warner Machine. I'm talking about Warner Gear, right?
Yes. Well, I think that they were organized and operated without a contract, I believe. No,
That may be. You had the vote,
I may be
labor...
wrong about that. I know that they were not recognized as
bargaining agent.
Sole bargaining rights for the employees of
Till
Warner.
37.
1937.
Uh-huh.
Well, before that time, there was a union there, and it was quite militant, as I remember.
Could that have been from the mechanics union? Could that have been from the old labor council that was here in Muncie? Now, this is sort of hazy to most of the people I talk to.
To me, too. I don't have any knowledge about that, really. I can tell you what happened at Warner Machine Products, but
but that was a few years after you left.
Leroy Roberts came in to see me one day, and he said, we've got your plant organized. And I said, well, I didn't know it, but I expect that's so. And he said, we want to bargain with you for the employees here. And I said, well, okay, we'll just start. And
who is Leroy Robbins?
Leroy Roberts.
Roberts
Was a UAW representative for this area.
Oh, I see.
He was succeeded later by Carl Parker and...
now that's the name I'm familiar with.
Oh, yes. Quite a number of other men that were in here. John Barty. And,
did you ever meet John Barty?
Oh, yes. Barty. Gosh, I can't remember them all. Leroy, there was a...
Elmer Davis?
I don't believe I remember him.
I've run across the name in reading. Let's see who else. LaRue Leonard?
Yes, LaRue Leonard, I met him.
Did you ever
negotiate
with these gentlemen?
Yes, all of them.
Have you?
Yes. Now,
Go ahead.
the bargaining might not have been with respect to the contract. It might have been with respect to grievances.
Mm-hmm.
But all of them have been in my office, not my present office, but the old Warner Machine.
Well, would you mind talking with me a little bit then about the union at Warner Machine Products? It came in, the UAW came in there in 37 or 38, somewhere along there, or was it before that?
Well, I had the opinion it came in about 35 or 36, but it may have been 37, might be just as good a day as that.
Maybe. I haven't run across this in reading. Acme Lee was 30, early 37, I believe, and Warner Gear was later in 37.
Well, then we were organized because I recall when we had a. No, I can't remember that either. I don't know what year.
What were some of the things that Mr. Roberts wanted when he came in to negotiate with you, representing the employees? What were some of the things that he wanted to ask for?
Well, the first thing that he asked for was exclusive bargaining rights. I can recall that. And closed shop. I don't remember that. A closed shop is not the proper term for it, but a union shop is the proper term, I believe.
Union shop means that you can hire someone who doesn't belong to a union, but if you keep him 30 days or 60 days
That's
or
right.
3 months.
He must belong, whereas a closed shop means that you have to hire from the union halls.
That's right. That's right. And that's illegal now, I believe.
Yes, I expect. I know that we refer to it as union shop. But I think there was not too much trouble with Mr. Leroy Roberts, as far as we were concerned. He wanted a different type of vacation and more pay, of course. He wanted, as I recall it, holidays with pay. I don't believe we gave them with pay at that time. And I do believe we had vacations with pay. But they wanted, as I recall it, 3% of the employee's total earnings for the year for 1 week's vacation pay. This was higher than they would have earned in 1 week. And I can remember Leroy said to me when I pointed that out, he said, well, they need a little extra money to go on a vacation. So, paid holidays, as I say, and the different classifications of wages, hourly rates. And, we had a system called the Bedaux point system, which had come over to us from Warner Gear. Mr. Harvey Wilson had helped us put that in when our plant was located on South Walnut Street on the second floor of the south side of the XL Electric Company. And this was a means of measuring the output of the employees and the machines. Also, bonus points in the Bedaux point system, a fourth of the bonus points were set aside in a separate fund for bonus payments to persons who were not actually productive workers, such as chip haulers, sweepers, and oilers, and
sort of supportive operations.
They had supportive operations, and the thought behind the idea was that they would be more interested in seeing that the machines were kept operating and that the chips were hauled away properly, and that the productive workers could produce more pieces without having to have various interruptions. And 25% of that bonus would accrue to this group of people. Well, this was something that we thought was very sacred and very desirable, but Mr. Leroy Roberts didn't. He thought any bonuses earned, any bonus points earned should go entirely to the individual that earned them. That was one of the things that we changed, of course. And we put in another incentive system.
That sounds very much, his position sounds very much like the economic laissez-faire point of view, doesn't it? The individual is rewarded directly for his own effort.
Yes, I'd say that was laissez-faire.
That's right.
There's no doubt about it.
Doesn't sound socialistic or any kind of collectivistic, does it? It sounds
No,
like individualism.
I don't think Leroy Roberts was socialistic. Although anybody that operated the plant and had somebody come in and say, well, now we're going to demand this of you, that of you.
This I wonder.
Couldn't help but think right away
Right.
whether or not this was socialism getting
Right.
started.
Right, I can certainly understand that, and I was going to ask you, is this your first, the first time that you had encountered this sort of thing where your employees had asked you to bargain with them collectively, or had you had a union before that of some kind?
No, we'd had no union before. When I finished MIT, I went to work for the Ford Motor Company in their Cambridge plant as an engineer, and I saw so many things there that I thought were very bad with respect to employees. They had no seniority, of course, and something that they might do would cause their dismissal immediately. People say, of course, that foremen played favorites. I suppose that there were things like that went on in many places, but foreman couldn't have been blamed for wanting to have people around him and working for him that produced the goods and made him look good in his department. But at the Ford Motor Company, I remember seeing fellows kept on jobs that were just sapping their strength and were too much for them. But the management was unwilling to transfer them to other jobs until they finally became ill or something of that sort and had to quit.
And you thought that was unfair treatment?
Oh, yes, very unfair. I saw several instances that I thought was extremely unfair, so I had I felt at that time a very proper and I don't like to use the word sympathetic because I know the workman doesn't wish to have sympathy, but I did have sympathy for these persons who were unable to move from a job that was really deleterious to their health.
How did you feel about Section 7A of the NRA? You remember that? Said that you must bargain with your employees collectively if they wanted to organize. Did you feel
that's so far back? I don't remember much.
How about the Wagner Act? You know about the Wagner Act?
Well, I know about it, yes, but
it said the same thing. You know that managers, corporations have to bargain with their employees collectively if their employees want to organize, and that the employer can't in any way interfere with the right of their workers to organize. What I'm really getting at, had you thought about this, and were you expecting someone such as Mr. Leroy Roberts to come in someday and say, Mr. Johnson, we have your
Yes, I had thought about it, and I've also was a member of the American Management Association, also National Association of Manufacturers. Of course, we were all briefed, and the Indiana Manufacturers Association, all of these trade associations briefed their members on what the laws were and what they could and what they couldn't do, and I have no, I think generally industrial management has no complaint about the basic features of these laws, but only about the interpretation that the Labor Board has put on some of the things, particularly with respect to throwing out elections that have gone against the union because of some contention that management made a threat, or in some letter or word of mouth or through a foreman said that if the plant was organized, it would shut down or move away or something of that sort.
These kinds of rumors floated around in Muncie in the 1930s. I don't know if you remember, but I'd read about it in the newspaper. There was a rumor that Warner Gare was going to lose the Ford contract, which got in the Muncie Star. There was another rumor that Chevrolet was going to move away. And of course, all these rumors were not ill-founded, because some corporations were forced to move away for various reasons.
Acme Lee was one that had
That's
to move
right.
away because of, and Muncie Gear had to move their operation, manufacturing of outboard motors to another location. They had, I believe, more reasonable opportunity to make a profit.
Did you get used to the idea after the initial shock of having someone come in and say, I represent your employees and you're going to talk with me about their conditions of employment? As you point out, this, of course, would be quite disconcerting to any man who owned a corporation or owned a business and was manager of a corporation, to have this happen all of a sudden. But after the negotiations and after working with the union representation for 2 or 3 or 4 years, did you get used to it and find that you could work with them without too much difficulty?
Yes, but that depended entirely on the attitude of the international representative and on the attitude of the president and chairman of the bargaining committee of the union and the bargaining committee itself. We've had...
Have you sometimes had what you just thought were absolutely unreasonable demands made that you could not work out an agreement on?
Yes, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
I think every company has. And we've also had people that we thought were quite reasonable and that did have an interest in seeing that the company prospered. Of course, it all goes back to just one thing as far as we're concerned at Warner Machine Products, and that is, can we continue to operate at a profit? Now, there are only two ways to operate. One is at a profit, and the other is at a loss. You can't operate right on the middle and come out just even.
You can't operate at a loss very long.
No, and you can't operate at a loss very long. So the question then always is how much profit is a reasonable profit on the amount of business you do, on the amount of risk that you take with your capital, on the number of employees you have, on the type of products you have, and there are so many ways to judge what a reasonable profit is. I don't think any two people could sit down and make a determination or agree on that point.
Oh, that's probably so. Our Professor Foster Ray Dulles and many other American labor historians, Mr. Johnston, say that American labor's objective has always been a larger slice of the pie.
Yeah.
In other words, what they really haven't wanted to control the industrial organization. What they really wanted is a larger paycheck. Is this essentially what you would conclude, or do you think this is a wrong interpretation?
Well, I think there are different forces in the labor movement and different forces in the labor picture. I believe it's correct to say that they just want more. That's all of the pie. And it's a reasonable thing.
And where the issue comes is how much of the profit should be considered reasonable for the corporation to keep, to pay their employees, and to pay the management, and also to plow back into industrial growth and development, and how much of it should go to the workers. Is this what it resolves down to?
Well, to a degree it does. There's so many facets of that. One is that a machine now that costs $100,000 used to cost $20,000. So that one of the problems today is depreciation and obsolescence allowances on equipment. The government puts restrictions on that, and in order to encourage companies to modernize and buy new equipment, they did. The Internal Revenues Department gave them a 7%. Well, I guess it was Congress that did that. Gave them a 7% allowance on new buildings, new equipment, and things of that sort. But I understand now that that's in the cards to be discarded, and I think it's unfortunate because although industry will continue to expand, this was an incentive to continue expansion and modernization.
I have to ask you a question here. You raised something that, of course, I'm a history major and a political science minor, and teach political science, and as such, I'm always watching to see what direction the government is going and this sort of thing. What direction is President Nixon leading to so far as his policy toward industry and toward the economy is concerned? Is he in favor of doing away with this 7% investment allowance that you have?
I understand that he's requested that it be eliminated, but I think that's not from so much the standpoint that he considers it an unfair bonus, as some people describe it, to business, but rather that he needs the revenue to help him balance his budget. And I know that when he was campaigning, he thought that the surtax should be eliminated as soon as possible, and perhaps by this summer, but now he's found that that can't be done. And I think the 7% allowance was that he's asked to have it removed, principally for the revenue that it will bring to the government. Now, as to what his attitude is toward business, I've been out of the country for quite a little while. I'm not up to date on just what's transpired since he's taken over the reins of government.
All right, very fine.
So I can't comment on how he feels about those things, or how I think he feels about them.
Fine. Do you get briefings or newsletters from, let's say, the NAM, which tries to keep the management informed as to such things as the abolition of this 7% allowance, that sort of thing?
Yeah.
They keep you up to date on.
Yes, NAM and the Indiana Manufacturers Association. The Chamber of Commerce doesn't have too much to say about it because our local Chamber of Commerce and the Indiana State Chamber of Commerce serve not only industry but all sorts of business and professional people as well.
Now, moving back to Warner Machine Products, which you evidently know more about than probably anyone else in the community. Do you still have a labor union?
Yeah.
Have new contracts been negotiated several times?
Yes, every 3 years. The past, I think our contracts for the last 5 times probably have been on a 3-year renewal basis.
Has the labor union, in your opinion, called things to your attention that were real needs of the employees that you were willing to grant that you might not have been aware of, that the labor union had noticed them and called them to your attention?
Only at times.
For example?
Depends on what sort of committee you might have. Sometimes we have committees that I think are more anxious to restrict the production and encourage soldiering and malingering among the employees.
How does one account for this? Now, it would seem that the employees ought to realize that their livelihood really depended on the economic success of the company they worked for, doesn't it?
Yes, it seems reasonable to expect that. I mean, I think that they should know that, and that's what we keep trying to say to them in our monthly newsletter to the employees of our company. And we think that most of our employees understand that. And I don't mean to say that these particular persons who encourage soldiering or malingering or giving 6 hours of work for 8 hours of pay necessarily want to ruin the company, but their job as a member of the bargaining committee or president of the union is strictly a political job, and it's like the politicians in government, and in cities, local, state. They all have to think up something else to do to hold their popularity with the voters, and in this case, the voters are the fellows that vote at the elections in the shop for the committeemen.
Well, what happens when someone leaves the shop, such as Paul Cooley, and goes out into public life? Does he still have this kind of responsibility, do you think, or does he have a broader constituency and therefore a broader responsibility?
Oh, I think he has a broader constituency and a broader responsibility, and anything, anybody that does anything such as Paul Cooley has can't help but get a broader view of things and less narrow. He's not, certainly not now, completely oriented to the labor movement or the working man's position. He has to take into consideration all of the other people in the community as well.
You feel then that for example, that you could call on him if you had a problem for your company and get the same kind of consideration that the labor union could call on?
Oh, I think so, yes. I think Paul is that kind of a man. I know him personally, I think, fairly well. I don't believe I've ever needed to ask him for a favor, but I think that if we felt that we were being discriminated against or needed some help from the city, that he would listen to our proposition and give it reasonable consideration.
Mr. Johnson, do you grant your employees now a paid vacation, 40-hour week and overtime if they work more than 40 hours? They have a retirement program, probably supplemental unemployment compensation.
No, we don't have a supplemental SUV. You mean?
Warner has it. I know.
No, we don't have it.
Well, seniority rights. Now, you had seniority rights before the union. I know you mentioned this.
Yeah.
That you believed in it, so you
Yeah.
instituted that. Now, would your employees, would your workers have had, essentially, in your judgment, I suppose it's about a judgment thing, a speculative thing, but would you have granted them essentially the same benefits that you have granted them without pressure from the union, or as a union?
I don't suppose so. They might have come eventually, but perhaps a little later, because the management is always thinking, well, we can do this, but not right now. You know what I mean?
It's a natural thing, you know. You
Yes,
want to add on to your
it'd be
house.
easier to do it later on than it would be to do it now. However, the labor pattern in Muncie has been established principally by Warner Gear, and their pattern is established by the automotive industry in Detroit, really, and in South Bend, when Studebaker was still operating. But I can recall when Warner Gear said, well, we'll meet the same wage rates as they have in Detroit and South Bend, and that didn't seem a reasonable thing to do, because the standard of living and the cost of living in a town the size of Muncie was quite different. I shouldn't say necessarily a standard, because I think the standard of living was higher than it was among the workmen in Detroit. But the cost of living in Detroit and transportation and all of the other things that are necessary there was greater than it was in Muncie. And I thought this was going to be a bad thing for the city, but apparently hasn't. At least Warner Gear hasn't prospered the way it did for a while. I think their employment now is somewhere around 3,800. It used to be as high as 6,000.
Yeah, I thought it was 5,000 when I worked there in the early 50s.
Yeah, I think it was nearly 6,000 at one time.
I was surprised to find that it's 3,000 whatever it is now.
Yeah, 3,500, something like that. We ourselves had to follow the Warner Gear pattern in with respect to many things, but have not been compelled by the union to do a number of things that are not part of the labor picture in our industry. We're a replacement parts industry, not an original equipment manufacturer.
Knowing what you know, Mr. Johnson, and having spent a lifetime in industry, if you were going to work in a factory, leaving high school or coming from a farm at 18 or 20 years old, would you want to be a member of a labor organization, or would you think it's a lot of nonsense, this gets in my way of my individual achievement, and so on and so forth? Was that too difficult a question to try to...
Well, I don't think it's a question that could be answered in the negative, because if you go to work for any of the plants around here, it's necessary that you belong to the union.
Mm-hmm.
And your mind's made up for you. If you don't want to belong to your union, you better not apply for work in a union shop.
All right. How do you feel about having to force a young man to join a union if he doesn't want to?
Well, we had 5 men in our union who are in our company that absolutely refused to join the union when we finally agreed to a union shop. And of those 5, 2 quit entirely and went into other work. And the other 3 I had talks with, and they finally reluctantly joined the union. Some of those men are still here.
Mr. Johnson, the